Hello, everyone. Welcome to LTV Talks. Today we have Angele with us, and we have a very fascinating topic, which is how cognitive biases shape user behavior and how we can use them to improve engagement, retention, and conversion, right? And I think it's been discussed a lot in a lot of podcasts and blog articles. But Angele is a senior product manager at Cleo AI, where she's leveraging AI and behavioral science to create better financial outcomes for their users. She's previously also led product and growth efforts at Peanut, Wise, and Street Bees, always with a strong focus on psychology driven strategies. And in this episode, what we thought would be interesting to do is to go through and understand how to use cognitive biases in our daily work and how Angel has done successfully over the years for her work. Maybe get a sense of where it's applicable and where it's not. But before that, welcome to the show, Angel.
Thanks for having me. And nice.
It's a pleasure. Maybe that's where we start, Angel. What are you doing? How did you get in touch with cognitive biases and this whole field of behavioral psychology? What got you interested?
Yes, I think it started a few years ago. Basically, when I was in uni, I had like a weird interest for behavioral economics, which is a little bit further from cognitive bias and things like that. But there is this idea of like, how can you influence economics using some psychology insights behind? So I read like a lot about like books like Predictably Irrational or like Free Economics, like these sort of books. And I thought it was like really, really fascinating. But post uni, I sort of stopped and I kind of got back to it. Interestingly, at Street Bees, I implemented a few things that relied on cognitive bias, but at the time I didn't realize it was the case. I kind of
Like,
blindly imitate things like only 10 spots left.
hmm.
And I had just seen that like competitors were doing it. And so honestly, I was quite a junior PM. I was just like, they do it. Let's do it. And let's measure if it works. And it did. But I didn't really think much of it. I was just like, great hack. Do whatever others do. And I would say that gradually I like started thinking a bit more about it. And it's when I joined Peanut, I worked closely with head of growth. And he was all about cognitive bias. He had printed like the wheel that has all the cognitive bias, and he would always be like, okay, what could we like, which one could we use? And that made me read a lot, and like I started getting really, really interested. And I sort of wanted to go a bit deeper than just implementing a few hacks and tips here and there. So it made me read like a few more books, just do lots of research, and I think it's one of those where the more interested and the more reading you do, the more interesting it gets. So I was pretty deep into it.
Great, similar backgrounds because I did my master's in management and user psychology was only introduced to us in sort of decision making. We had a very good course on decision making, which was on like probabilities and things like that. But I got interested with like similar suspects, right? Like Dan Ariely and, Nudge Freakonomics, all these books,
Yeah.
IDEO, and then you start thinking like how all our decisions are influenced by these things that people are actually designing for and not just a matter of factly.
Yeah,
But
it's definitely then the haha moment, like, wow, it's actually like in my life every day, and I'm very influenced by it, but I just don't know about it. This is crazy.
yeah, and maybe for people who don't know, which I suspect there are very few of now that it's very mainstream a topic, what is cognitive bias? Like how would you explain it to someone like a junior PM who's starting out and who's looking to understand this?
I think the way that I understand it is I really like the metaphor of like when you drive a car and that like so if you've ever learned to drive or ever want to learn to drive, when you start to learn how to drive a car, you're going to find it exhausting because you'll have like your brain being constantly like, oh my God, what should I do? What decision should I make? And like those decisions are made in a very conscious way. And that's like what Kahneman defines like system one. It's like your very aware like brain. And then as like things get more natural, you kind of get used to things, you automate them, and just your brain enters this very like automatic workflow where you might even be able to drive like from work to home without even thinking or realizing it in some sort of like kind of like dreamation. That's not tiring at all for your brain.
Hmm.
And the thing is, 90%, 95% of your decisions are made with like the second system, which basically it's like this automated version of your brain that's just like uses learned mechanism, learnings from the past to make decision without really bothering you in a way. And it means that the same thing happens whenever you scroll a website, when you scroll an app, when you do like anything in your life, your brain basically like just switches to automatic mode and makes decisions for you. And this brain is great because it's energy efficient. It can work really quickly. Doesn't bother you. So yeah, it's very efficient, but it has some flaws because it doesn't really use rational thinking behind. It just tends to like use past experience to make those decisions. And what this means that it can be influenced and biased. And given that this is the brain that you use 95% of the time, it means that like we are all like very easily biased. And in what using cognitive bias means is basically using these little flows or shortcuts that your brain takes in order to influence behavior in the way you want it.
And is this why someone like a product manager or anyone working in marketing would be naturally interested here? Because then your work in a lot of ways is to influence behavior. And when I say influence, it doesn't need to be always be a bad thing. I feel like, like your app, right? Like Cleo, if you're using that influence to make people have better decisions, better outcomes, then it's you can also use it for a lot of good. And but is that would you say that is the core of why people who are working front end with the users need to get better at understanding these biases? Or how would you like make a case for learning this, or as a good skill to have?
I think it's two things. I think as a person, like living a life, a human life, it's very interesting to understand in a way, it's like understanding the limitations of your mind and understanding that like you might think that you always make the right decision, but most likely you're not because it's your system too, like your automated like version that's just like, yes, 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 whatever. I've seen that before, let's go. So it's first interesting to know that like you're very biased and we all are, and you apply like constantly apply like learnings from the past to make decisions. And so I think from that perspective, it's quite fascinating to get a sense of like, oh, how does my brain and my thinking works? And then as soon as if you have a work where you try to influence others, and influence could mean many things, like a policymaker tries to influence them. And I think the examples in Nudge is like the way you display food in like a high school canteen will impact what students eat. Like, because if you put like the salad first, they'll eat more salad. And if you put French fries first, well, they'll eat French fries. So that's a way to influence things. And it's not product or marketing, but then indeed, most product managers or marketing managers will try to influence behaviors. As you said, not necessarily in an evil way, but that's what you're trying to do at the end of the day.
Yeah, 100%. And I agree, by the way. Like, I remember this one very good example. And there's this book called Stumbling on Happiness by Dan Gilbert. And the introduction of that book is by showing illusions, where you see a drawing and then your brain sort of thinks that it's moving or whatever. And he mentioned how interesting this is because it's an illusion, but still you can't stop your brain from doing the things that it will just do, right? Like that's how it works. So it's like we are making this systematic. It's a process that you're influencing, and it could be, to your point, right? Like cafeteria. I've used that at my home, like just increasing friction from all the junk food. I guess I'm sure that's the first thing that people must have tried who learn about cognitive biases, but that was also what
Yeah.
I did or tried doing.
No, 100%. And then it goes into also like how to build or destroy a habit, which I think like for every single person has tried to like build or destroy a habit once. And then cognitive bias and understanding how you can trick your brain is actually really interesting.
Yeah, 100%. And but if that it is that important as a thing, right? Like if we make all these decisions based on this, how do we translate that into the work that we do, right? Like how do we, when you started off as a junior PM, walk us through the aspects of the work that you felt now that you look back and you feel like, oh, actually, if I use cognitive biases in my work in during brainstorming or in different stages, like where are the things applicable and where should a practitioner sort of focus on when they're trying to apply these concepts to their work?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that like one thing that I want to highlight is like as powerful and interesting they are, cognitive bias have never ever replaced like a product strategy they can be a little bit harmful as well. So it's important to understand that, like, if you only rely on tricks and stuff, like, then it's really hard to build trust with your audience. I would say that an error would be like to get overly excited with them and try to apply them in every single situation, thinking that it's going to solve your problem or replace a strategy. I think they're very much on the tactical side rather than on the strategic side. So in a way, I'm sort of like, if you're getting started, that's probably cognitive bias is probably not where you want to focus at first, because you probably want to focus more on like developing a good product sense of like, what do my users want? What are their needs? What are their problems, pain points? How can I fix that and build your product strategy based on this? Where cognitive bias come in is more like, once you move to the execution side, how do you solve that problem? So a good example of this is at Cleo. So we're trying to, like, we're a budgeting app, and our goal is to improve like the financial life of our users. And so we focus on the US market, where the credit score is the most important. It's basically like a credit score is the reflection of your entire financial life. If you have a good credit score, life is great. You can access like all sorts of financial services, like buy a house is going to be cheap and all these things. If you have a bad credit score, it really makes your life extremely complicated. Like even like things like renting a place, like your landlord will check your credit score and that will block you. It's very, very essential, but at the same time, it's sort of a long-term exercise to improve a credit score. And I think we all tend to focus on short-term thing. And I think that's kind of your problem. It's like, yeah, all of our users want to improve a credit score, but none of them are ready to sacrifice to make the small steps that will lead them to a better credit score and a better financial life, because it feels like a far away objective that's hard to reach and will require a lot of sacrifices on the way without always a very clear payoff. Which is kind of the same problem that we see when it comes to climate change. Like, it's hard to change people's behavior for something that feels a bit far away, or learning a language. And it's interesting because there are lots of parallels with that problem in Duolingo, what Duolingo tries to solve, which is like, everybody would like to learn a second language, but it's very hard, it's long, takes time and stuff. And then it becomes a question of like, how might I break this down in order to make it feel accessible and rewarding, so that you can build a habit around like improving your credit score or learning a language and do it regularly, and we know that consistency is very much the key here. So that's where cognitive bias can help you, but they don't help you define the first problem, which is like, I want to learn a language and I can't build a habit. I want to improve my credit score, but I struggle to commit to it and do it consistently.
Yeah, and I completely agree. Like, if I reframe it, like, it's almost, you're saying, okay, so you have a goal, and we always have these tendencies to prefer short term over the long term, right? And with all these tactical pieces, you're trying to fill in that gap so that you bring that long term to feel much more short term, but in a way that helps you achieve those goals, right? Like, I think I remember reading somewhere about smoking habits, and how, in all the bad things you can do for your health, it's one of the worst things, of course, that you can do for yourself. But because when you smoke, you don't see your lungs getting bad necessarily, very quickly. The feedback loop is so long that you just keep doing it, and that you never get a reason to stop. And replacing that with a short term effect where you smoke and you see the impact somewhere, even if it's digital, might give you like a way to exploit that behavior, right? 100%.
And making it feel reachable. I should say, I stopped smoking not that long ago, and for me, it was telling myself like, okay, I'm going to stop smoking for 21 days, and 21 days is how long it takes to be a non-smoker in theory. Like any habit, everybody says like it's 21 days, and then like you've changed your habit. And somehow telling myself like it's 21 days, and then I reached that, and by 3 weeks, you don't really want to smoke that badly. It kind of naturally cut off. So but obviously it's tricking your brain. But yeah, from a product perspective of marketing, again, it will never like explain the why, and it will never replace like solving an important problem and understanding your user pain. It's very much on the what do you do to help with that. once you
Yeah.
can solve the problem first.
Yeah, I think there's also another part of this, right? Like, I worked with LifeSum, right? So the idea is that you have to log your food, you have to log your exercise, and as soon as you start logging or writing in a diary about the food that you're having, you tend to make better choices over a period of
Mm,
time. And one of the struggles was that, people are motivated and they start, and then as soon as they find out how boring logging is, they sort of fell off. Yeah. And so we used a tactic which was just like the gradient effect, I think it's called, where, if you see you have made some progress, you are likely to stick with it until you finish it. So it's like
mhm.
a checklist, and we have seen this across different products. So when someone hears it, it seems so obvious, right? Like LinkedIn does. Your profile is 20% complete, or a Bumble or whatever. And we did something similar where we said, okay, you've just registered, you have given us your preferences, so you're already set up. Now, here are the next three things you need to do to be good. And then that seems much more achievable. So and we found out that people actually did stick to it
Yeah.
much more.
I think it was, yeah, was that the completion bias as well, where like it's very satisfying to complete a task and very unsatisfying to leave it like halfway through.
Mm,
So like
100%.
you can use these.
But the other question that I then have is like, right, we decided to use this this effect or this cognitive bias or this sort of tendencies of our brain. But there are so many of them, right? Like the cognitive bias chart that you were referring to, I think, how many cognitive biases are listed there?
Probably over 100 for sure.
Yeah. So how did you and your manager who introduced you to this sort of system to help come up with these tactics, like how did you guys go about deciding which bias to pick or which bias to play with, right? Does it come from the user understanding and then you pick based on intuition, or how does someone go about picking the bias that that fits well or that makes the most sense?
That's a really good question. I think that it's sort of like it starts with like what are you trying to do, which
Mm-hmm.
is pretty obvious, but like there is a slight difference between you pushing someone to build a new habit or you're trying to make them break from a bad habit.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're trying not to them to convince them not to do something. So then you're going to use slightly different bias. I think in general, like you do have like a bit of a top 10 cognitive bias that tend to like be very powerful. I think like the one that comes a lot is loss aversion, and it's some biases are more powerful than others, I would say.
What is loss aversion for someone who might not know?
Yeah, so loss aversion is the idea that losing something is twice as painful as winning something. So if someone wins $10, it's not as sad. It's like the equivalent like sadness of losing $10 is just not there. It hurts a lot more to like
Hmm.
lose $10. And so what this means is that you see it on all like websites that do e-commerce. It's like only five left because that triggers this like, ooh, like I might lose like this opportunity of buying it. And it's combined with scarcity. This idea of like if something feels rare, it's like feels more attractive in a way. You see it as like a great deal today only, making you feel like, damn, if I buy it tomorrow, I'll miss out on this incredible like deal. Like all the sentences, like don't miss out. Like they really are here to trigger your loss aversion. And it's a principle that's been proven like multiple times on pretty much like with so
Every
many
product.
experiments. So we know that it's a very powerful one.
Yeah, I by the way, I heard a very good example of the same effect on booking.com, which I
Mm,
found was a great finding in the same effect, right? Like, so when we think of loss aversion, most people would focus on like changing the content or the copy to reframe it in a way that seems like a loss, right? So
yeah,
you gain premium access versus you will lose access to these features, right? Like extend your trial versus you are going to lose your premium access in X times is a
yeah,
very common tactic, right? But then I heard about this booking.com, this interview somewhere, and she mentioned how when you are searching for an accommodation on their website, they of course have these right effects like it's selling out fast, etc. But what was the craziest insight was when you search for accommodation, you know how they show these grayed out properties which are sold out?
Yeah,
They just showing that properties have indeed sold out made people buy much faster and more versus
crazy.
showing just the available properties, which might be a better user experience if you think about it, but
Yeah,
the bias overplays your decision making.
that's crazy. Yeah, I had never heard of this example, but it does make sense. But also,
Yeah,
like, I have a little sister, and we're like four siblings in my family, and I remember that, like, when we wanted to make her finish her plate and she was small, we would be like, it's the last one. Like, you're sure you don't want it? It's the last one. And that worked so well. And then, like, I vividly, like, remember that we were doing this to, like, get
yeah,
her to finish her plate. And I'm like, it was a cognitive bias.
yeah, 100%. And it's funny to believe that how as adults we still do a lot of those same behaviors now.
Yeah.
What about other cognitive biases that are on your like sort of the more powerful list that you have seen in your experience, and how have you, maybe just some examples of how you've used them would also be whenever you have them, right? Like you mentioned loss aversion. I think there's social proof, which is also
Yeah.
quite common, but I have personally never have been in an experiment where social proof really proved very impactful for us. But have you had any experiences with using a bias and what worked, and maybe if you have an example of applying a cognitive bias that didn't work, I would
Yeah.
love to hear them.
Yeah, we've like recently we've experimented a lot with like upsells basically in the app. So trying to like improve the content and see like what works and what doesn't. And like, so there are like very small experiments that we did like fully focused on content. And the ones that like we've used like things like social proof, like adding, for example, a testimonial. So like your social proof is like this idea if other people recommend it, then you're really likely to do it. Adding testimonials to make it feel like, okay, other people think it's good. We've also played like quite a bit with loss aversion, and we experimented. What's the other copy that we used? Completion bias. So like you have not finished this, like make sure you complete it. Like this is the last step. A little bit like gradient, but we really wanted to play more with the like we're really about like small content tweaks rather than like UI changes. So we focused more on like you've not finished this and completion bias. And we saw that like there was a significant difference based on like which one you were using.
Okay.
Testimonials didn't work for us.
Interesting.
Then we
On to
went on to
something.
something. We discovered that testimonials actually never work, but no.
Yeah.
So that didn't land, but we saw good progress with loss aversion was really good, followed by completion bias. What's incredible is that these changes, although like they're really small, like they're like copy changes, they're not like very huge, like can have like a very significant impact on the conversion rates.
Mhm.
And another one that we had was we played with copies on like CTA. So we had one that was like kind of very high level, like apply now. Another one was very specific, like applied for your card. So very, very specific. And then apply for your card now, which creates a bit of this like emergency like feel. And we saw that just adding the word now actually had like a significant impact again on click-through
Really?
rate. Yeah. And so like the more specific and adding now was like on like several occasions, like converting better, which is quite interesting as well.
Yeah, what I find interesting in these is like sometimes I listen to these tests and I'm like, as a marketer and someone who is interested in the topic. Now, whenever I see a website which is saying now, I'm very um I'm very defensive about it. I see it and I know what they're trying to do, and I always think to myself like everyone is like that, right? Like everyone just behaves and they know that this is a trick or this is just a way to create that sense of urgency, etc. But it's insane how effective it is. Like when I see my wife making decisions sometimes, or my friends, and then I see
Yeah,
this and they're almost oblivious to it. And that's where I think like at least one of the things that I learned was also while applying these things, as you learn more about it, you have a feeling that they will be less effective because
yeah,
you feel like, oh, this is so straightforward, right? Like it makes
yeah, yeah.
people
I know
will
what
be
you're
on to
doing.
us, but it's not the case, right? It's very effective.
Yeah. And I think that's
What
where it
about
goes back to trust as well, because overusing them can also have a negative impact on trust. And it's interesting because a company like TransferWise and Wise is used to transfer money from one place to another. And they do that at like a way lower cost than like large banks. And also their whole motto is like, we're like faster, cheaper, more convenient, but more importantly, we're all about transparency. Like they've always focused on transparency to really differentiate them from traditional banks, because they tend to like always have like hidden fees and like play with the fact that people don't fully understand how financial products and especially FX rates work. And for example, I do think that Wise not using a single cognitive bias, apart maybe from like social proof. They had like testimonials like on the website and like few other things like that, but like they would never use like apply now, like only comfort, or like that's not something that they use within the product. And in a way, I think that's what builds their credibility as a brand, and like has part of their success is positioning themselves in a position to like traditional banks by like being all about transparency. So a lot of like I do agree that like it can be counterproductive to like systematically be like only 10 spots left when it's not true. Like
Yeah.
it's just about being still like transparent and what are you trying to achieve behind.
And I think that goes back to what you said about like strategy comes first. And so I think like with Wise, it's very clear like they want to build on transparency. And so automatically you would never think of these tactics fit into that strategy or play into that strategy, even if it increases conversion rate, etc. Right. One thing about Wise, by the way, is that I'm a huge fan. I I love their emails sometimes where they change their terms and conditions. They
Mm-hmm.
send out emails and they explain it to you like a 10-year-old, right? Like they explain to you how
Yeah.
banks make money and how
Yeah.
we are still cheaper. Like I remember this one email where they were like, we are increasing our fees.
Yeah.
And then they explained why banks have traditionally charged these fees
Mm-hmm.
and what a normal bank charges and how they are charging, but it's for, where it will be used. And I've always found that now whenever Wise sends me an email about terms and condition changes, that's the only email I open because I feel like I'll learn something and they'll be very honest about it.
Yeah.
Whereas others send you to this external link where it's a small type font and they've written tons of things, right? So it goes a long way.
Yeah, it's like a product philosophy behind is totally different than what you find in other places.
What about anchoring? Like, I feel one thing that anchoring is like basically first impressions that set expectations, and then people have used that for pricing, of course. So you show them a big price to start off with, and then your brain automatically thinks in that zone. So if you ask me how much I charge, and if I say $1,000, then your brain will never bargain for $10, right? Like you'll think around that ballpark when you negotiate and or whatever. And so apps have used the same tactics with pricing or anchoring, right? So they tell you about something, and um, then your expectations are always compared against what they have sort of said before. Have you had any experience with anchoring, or have you used it in your work at all?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've used it like for in the context of monetization, like kind of like usual, like based on the order in which you put your plans, that will anchor a different amount. So, for example, if you put your yearly or lifetime subscription offer first, it's going to be a really high price, and then like a monthly or weekly is going to feel like very cheap. So what you'll see is that, and I did like verify that if you place like a full price lifetime subscription and then immediately after 50% off monthly subscription, like the price difference will mean that like the monthly feels very, very cheap. So that's one way you can anchor. And it's used a lot for monetization in the way you like most apps will try to like the first day you join you will have like a plan that is very expensive, but if you come back 2 days later you'll have a 50% offer, meaning that like that plan is not now like significantly cheaper. The power of that is two things. First, you capture like really high intent users at their highest price that they would want, so it's a good way to like, if a user is willing to pay full price, then you can capture him then. And then like it also anchors a high price, meaning that your other users who come back a few days later might be like, oh, this is actually like not that outrageously expensive.
Mm.
So that's one way that I think it's used across the industry, like in pretty much every app, and like that I've seen it in practice, like where we tested and we did verify that it works. A more quirky example, which is interesting, is we launched I launched like a cashback product recently.
Mhm.
So it's like you spend and then you get a percentage on your card. And we thought it was actually a really good offering and it didn't work. And it's been very disappointing. It's still running at the moment as an experiment, but it's not landing.
Mhm.
I was very sad. I was very excited about it as well. And we've like done a lot of like brainstorming about like why didn't it work? Like maybe it's the lack of awareness, maybe it's the like visibility. And lots of like had a very long list of hypotheses and interest, and we verify some of it through user research, like with a survey and then like chatting to users. And interestingly, like an error that we've done is that the users who were very much like, let's build an MVP version, so like bare minimum in terms of features. And so whenever a user would spend on a transaction that was eligible for cashback, they would receive it immediately. And it would appear in their transaction list immediately on their bank account. So you spend, it's eligible, you receive like the percentage. And we think that potentially that incurs a very small price, mainly because, and like other products like Amex only show you the amount of cashback you've received at the end of the year. So by then you have a very high amount and that incurs like, wow, this is really valuable. I've made like $300 out of this. But because we show it gradually, it feels a bit like, oh, I've made like $1.20. Great. Like, I don't care. So we do think that we got like anchoring here has been negative because the perceived value is way lower than the valuable product, which is actually not that
Mhm.
bad. That's an example of like not doing a great job at anchoring a high amount for your users.
And you always feel like it's the small wins that you're getting rather than the big cashback, right?
Yeah. Sorry, that was very
Something similar.
confusing. I'm very deep in, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does, it does. And I think like that's also the other interesting thing about these applying these as tactics, right? Like sometimes you get it, sometimes even the same tactic would work for a set of users and then not work for another app or another service. And that's also what I find very fascinating, that it's not a given that if something worked for one app, the other, it works for the other. For example, the same example of anchoring, we used it once where for a fitness app
Mm-hmm.
where it was, I think, like $30 a year subscription.
Yeah.
And what we started doing is, now of course a lot of apps do it as well. They show you what does that mean as a daily cost, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I remember we did this like bunch of blast campaigns. They were emails, and it was all they were all like, how often do you think about that cappuccino that you bought, right? And this is 10x cheaper than buying a cappuccino every day to work. And we tried framing it. I think that's the framing effect, perhaps, maybe not anchoring.
Yeah.
But that's worked really well, and people started thinking about the product in a very different light. And I think that is also very, I don't see it very used very commonly apart from paywalls.
Yeah.
But I think that's also very strong lever for teams. And there are like bunch of other examples, right? As you start reading, you will see so many amazing studies around this. um,
Yeah. No, that definitely, and I think indeed, like we often saying, like cognitive bias, like paywall, and how can
mm,
I leverage them, like in that context? When I do think it goes way beyond, and typically, I think the example with that cashback is an example of like we didn't think through like how cognitive bias would influence our test, and we
mm,
didn't think enough about the perception that our users would have of the value. When I think if we had been designing a paywall, we would have been very, very mindful of it, and it's not an
yeah,
error that we would have made.
yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. Perfect. We've spoken about, like, some cognitive biases and how you've applied them, and like what are the biggest or some of the more commonly used biases and some examples of them. I'd love to understand from you how, let's say you are a CRM manager or a product manager, or you're working on engagement or retention, and you say, okay, that's my funnel, that's what I want to improve, and let me get started now, right? Like today is my day one. How, and you've understood like what your sort of core user experience looks like. You understand where the business wants to go. How do you start from there, and like how would you reimagine this process with the knowledge of cognitive biases, right? Like, how do you sort of systematically introduce this in your experimentation process? How do you sort of make a case for it, right? So how do I go about from ideation stage and factor in all these biases and start thinking about it, because it can be overwhelming, right? So I would
Yeah,
love to know, how do you sort of factor this into your working process, as in when you were doing these copy tests, for example, right? How did you sort of go about them?
yeah, I think it's definitely like, I guess that like first when you build your funnel the first time, you can think of like, okay, what are I think some cognitive bias I can use. I don't think that like, like the guy was like, you should always have it printed, and like it was the wheel was like 150. It does feel a bit overwhelming, so maybe it's more like print the top 10 cognitive bias that you think you can use or are used across the industry, and that these can be found like quite easily, and like refer to them like as like, okay, is there something that I could use like at each step, knowing that quite often it's not rocket science. It's going to be like in your copy, like add a little tweak or like something that leverages one of those like bias. And I think it's honestly it's really easy to do. And then wherever once you've built your basics, then it's a matter of like looking at like what are my high drop off points. So like looking back on your funnel, like this might be like the intro screen, paywall, and like you will have like always like a few key screens that lead to a higher like drop off, and these are the ones where you want to experiment with maybe like a few variations of like with like different cognitive bias. So maybe like, okay, variant A will be focused on X, variant B will be like progressive disclosure, variant C will be loss aversion. Just like test one against the other, focusing on these like high friction areas.
Yeah, I really like that, and I think something similar, right? If you know about Irrational Labs, they have the CB framework, right? Which I also found very useful whenever I was using these as a how do you say, like, just as a brainstorming session,
Yeah.
which was also very useful. Which is, so they have 3B, which is behavior, barrier, and benefits. And what you can do with that is, like, let's say you are improving engagement, you map out the user funnel, like, more or less. For example, I want to take users who are from, I don't know, 0 workouts to 5 workouts, right? So the behavior you're trying to work on is getting people to that, their first workout, whichever funnel you're focusing on. And then what they recommend you do is you then say, okay, what are the biggest barriers why someone doesn't do it, right? And you might be off, but the idea is to first brainstorm like the reasons why someone might not do it. So being lazy or whatever, right? Like, you just don't understand the value proposition, etc., etc. And then what are the benefits? So if you were to do that first workout, why do people who do it end up doing it, all right? And then you list out all the benefits. And then once you do that, then it's a lot easier for you to pick up a barrier and then say, okay, which bias is at play or which effect is at play, and how which tactics could be, could reshape that behavior, right? Which I also found a very interesting use case of how to apply this.
Yeah, that's a really good framework. Also because I think it leads you to, because I guess behind each cognitive bias you do want to have like a clear hypothesis
Hmm.
and formulate it in a really clear way to make sure that your test like has like a clear learning down the line. And I think that
100%.
it's the 3B framework is a great way to like form those hypotheses and have clarity over like which one do I want to verify,
Hmm.
because I have like most conviction at this stage.
Yeah, 100%. And in your experience, like, and I can speak to this a lot myself as well, but in your experiences applying these cognitive biases, like, what are some of the common mistakes or themes that, let's say I want to apply this to my work, what are some of the common mistakes that I should be sort of steering clear of, or I should keep in mind, so that I don't fall into a trap that, that most people might fall off when applying these kind of techniques, right? Like, what are the common mistakes, and what mistakes did you make?
I think the main one is like, first there is a bit like something around trust. I do think that like overusing and over relying on cognitive bias means that like gradually you can hurt like customers' trust. And I think like booking is an example where they have an incredible conversion, but I do think a lot of people have a bit of pushback when they land on the website, feeling a bit like, this really does not feel transparent. It feels a bit like you're trying to trick me into something that's into behavior that I don't want to do. Or it's the same with like airlines when you book a flight and you have like 5 like things that leverage cognitive bias that are honestly very close to a dark pattern. I think over time, like you might see a short-term LTV gain, but it will like lead to loss of trust in your product, which long-term means that like it might hurt like, and it's very hard to then like measure, but you might hurt like acquisition because you won't have any word of mouth. You might hurt like other metrics, which in that short-term experiment isn't clear. So I think a lot of it is like focusing too much on short-term like revenue, LTV like metrics without considering like the bigger picture of like how that impacts your user experience and like user trust. That's definitely one, overdoing it. And then I do think there's something about, yeah, like the way you measure success needs to be very clear. An example is like Peanut. So Peanut is a dating app. It was easy, for example, it was easy to improve the match rate, so get more people to more women to connect, but it didn't necessarily lead to more conversations. And so if you only focus, like it's an example of like if on a dating app, like even take Tinder was only focusing on like how many matches you get, it doesn't mean it's a success. And there are lots of cognitive biases you can use to make users connect more. You might say like you might even like be able to automatically match them or like use other like tricks and stuff. And like you only have like 4 matches today, so make sure you use your swipe. Like there are lots of ways you could influence user behavior, but then the quality of the connection goes down and they have less conversation. So it's kind of like not taking into account your secondary metrics and guardrails basically whenever you run an experiment.
That's so interesting. And I feel like that's also a very common trap for actually not only for cognitive biases, but like I think for any testing, right? Like sometimes we focus too much on that one metric and then we sort of neglect the secondary metrics or the risk metrics or however you want to call it, right? Like you want to sort of also have a bigger or larger picture. What about the mistakes? Like one thing that I have found very difficult while implementing this is, for example, you had a natural tendency to read more and you found this topic which was interesting. And so I imagine you've read up a lot of different ways this test was applied. And then you get to this core essence of that bias, right? And you understand what it's trying to do. One mistake or one common thing that I struggle with is that whenever you start doing this at a team level, the understanding of that bias is also varying. So someone reads just one example and they feel like social proof is all about just testimonials, right?
Mhm.
But social proof is also a lot, like if you go to the core of it, it's about affiliation, it's about status, right? Like you are indicating someone that I belong in this group, or you're indicating that I, belong to this class or whatever, right? And that's the benefit you're getting. Of course, testimonials are a way to show that some people have benefited, so you are more likely to benefit as well. But that sort of depth of understanding of a bias is also very difficult, and I find that as a very big difficult conversation, because then you have a room full of people who have very different level of understanding of these biases and how they are actually applied. Have you found that to be an issue, or like do you have any tips to tackle that while you're working on an experiment?
Yeah, I have like I can definitely see what you mean by this, and I've seen it a little bit as well on like basically kind of like let's just blindly apply like whatever has worked on like. I also see that a bit with like competitor research. Was like, oh, let's just do the same thing, and you're like, we have a very different audience. Like we might have some similarities, but we also are very different as a product. So I don't think we can just blindly like copy whatever like has been done or like just like apply like blindly a cognitive bias because like X report said like when the day I added this it improved conversion 10 times. So yeah, definitely like something to be a bit careful on like, and I think that's where behind it's form a hypothesis and then try to see how you apply that bias. But like without a hypothesis then you're not learning anything. And ultimately, your goal should be to learn something, not just to add some like and like
Yeah,
do a copy change.
yeah, I think like that's been the essence of this conversation as well, right? Like I feel like one of the takeaways to actually always focus on strategy first, focus on hypothesis, the fundamentals of a test first, and then sort of use cognitive biases or your understanding of these tactics as a very optimization layer, right?
Yeah,
It's a way to get maybe cleverer with your experimentation ideas and see gains which have been studied, researched for ages, right? Like there's a very good science behind it, so you don't have to come up with your own experiments. And then I think one interesting thing that you mentioned that I also feel is very new to me is like how do you sort of start scoring these effects for your audience, right? Like how do you make your own sort of framework or metrics to say, okay, by for our audiences, loss aversion is key. Like
yeah,
booking.com, I think, whereas for a Vice, it could be completely different, right? And then you need to sort of have an understanding there.
yeah. I think a lot of it behind is what you want your user to feel, and what's important. And like for Wise, it was like primarily like it's about trust and it's about transparency. Social proof, great. Art like artificial, anything that feels artificial, like such as like scarcity on like only 100 transfers left, very bad. So audience would know that like it's not true. There's never been like a set number of transfers that Wise can complete. Like
Yeah.
it's kind of like thinking a bit like what are we trying to share? What's our goal and how do we want to share, or how do we want our audience to feel?
Yeah. I have this experiment idea, by the way, that I have never gotten to apply, but I'm very keen to, which is, you know, how these e-commerce websites have like a fashion outlet
Hmm.
have these things where you say notify me if it's back in stock.
Yeah.
And I feel like now it's been used so much that people start hating giving out email addresses because then you get these flood of emails from these fashion outlets, and then you
Yeah.
only after a month you realize that something is back in stock.
Yeah.
I have this feeling that it could be a very good premium feature that you make people pay for.
Mm,
You know, like I think it's worth testing that you can be notified if you pay €1. So we'll notify you the first
yeah.
if
Instead
this
of
becomes, you know, this comes back in stock, and almost position it as a separate.
like premium.
Yeah, exactly. I want to really try that. So if any app wants to try it, please approach me. Uh, Perfect. Well, it was super fun. I see you have a lot of Substack activity going on. Do you want to speak about that a little bit before we close the discussion for today?
Yeah, like very quickly, like I've started that Substack journey like in December. So just starting to write, and if you just want to read a bit more about like this cognitive bias and many other things as well, give it a go.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think you're underselling.
So sorry.
I think you're underselling your content, by the way. Like some of your blog articles. Let me read the headlines. I think like the one that I was talking to you about just before we started recording was how Meta and Spotify's, you know, algorithms are now sort of geared towards promoting this AI generated music. And I thought this was such an interesting article. So
Thank
there's
you.
definitely a lot of content that's worth reading out there.
Trying to. Have you find it interesting?
100%. It's called Built for People, so do check it out. And yeah, any closing remarks, Angel, before we say goodbye?
Not for me. Thanks for having me. It was super nice, really interesting chat as always.
Yeah, same here. Thank you for being there. Bye.